on ineffective police leadership, a study conducted by Dr. Schaefer from 2010, but still has some really important and very relevant information that we can all use. So before we dive in, take a moment to think of a police leader who displayed, over a period of time, especially ineffective leadership traits, habits, or characteristics. Think about what those were, how they impacted you, and what it was that made that leader particularly ineffective. Now that you've had some time to think about it, let's dive into this study and see what those ineffective leadership traits, habits, or characteristics could be. Here's another way to think about this. What did that poor police leader say or act that prevented them from being an effective leader? Essentially, what barriers or issues inhibited them from becoming the best leader they could be? So let's dive in. So Dr. Schaefer conducted this survey at the FBI National Academy between October 2006 and April 2007. He covered 3 National Academy classes and administered this to 50 participants, basically within the first days of attending it, and that was to minimize their knowledge bias. 304 answered the question. 91% were based in the US, although some, of course, the National Academy classes are international. There was a lot of experience, over 19 years just about. It also, the average time for supervisory experience was 10 years. And of course, 25% had prior military. So let's look at the findings here, kind of the common theme. So basically, he was able to identify 2 main bodies of issues, and he calls them acts of commission and acts of omission. And he broke each down into 5 sub-elements, essentially focusing on the self over others, ego or arrogance, being closed-minded, micromanager, and being capricious or political. The acts of omission include issues surrounding poor work ethic, failing to act when needed, being an ineffective communicator, having a lack of interpersonal skills, and a lack of personal integrity. So let's talk about the self over others issues. This is essentially the idea that careerism is alive and well. Essentially, I win and you lose. I gain and you don't. This is the important piece to understand, that just because someone wins doesn't necessarily mean that someone loses, right? The old adage, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? This can occur, this careerism can occur at various times, and it's important to understand that they need to be able to think about how they can benefit others over a period of time. Ego and arrogance, or ego arrogance. Of course, this begs the question, what is the difference between arrogance and self-assuredness or self-confidence? Is this one thing to think about in terms of the adage, my way or the highway? Essentially, doing things single-handedly without listening or considering alternate viewpoints. The issue here is primarily a lack of humility. Quoting from the study, their near absolute belief in their own opinions and judgments could have been their undoing. Being closed-minded is unable or unwilling to listen to others. They don't want feedback, perspectives, or ideas. They are insular, they keep their own counsel, and they don't identify when changes are needed either in the internal environment or the external environment. Essentially, they're out of touch with reality. Micromanagers are people who need to do everything. They are overzealous and overbearing. They don't trust the people that they've hired, or they have that in their ability. They really want the control. So the questions here are, how do we strike the balance between control and autonomy? Of course, control can be very important. It's an important management tool. But we have to build trust in our relationships, and we can't micromanage because we can't do everything, and we need to accept that. Being capricious or political is an overly concern with the external matters, primarily the political environment, especially at the state and local level. These organizational politics can also overtake the mission and objectives. And there's also inconsistency here. Other themes included arbitrary decisions, cronyism or nepotism, bringing in family or friends, and putting personal relationship ahead of the important results. Part of the questions here are, how do we use communication to be more transparent? And how do we move when we move from a high performer into a formal supervisor? How do we then manage those personal relationships, right? How do we transition in a way that is fair and impartial? Let's move to the acts of omission. These include poor work ethic, the idea of somebody's already retired in place, they're lazy, or they have lost commitment or enthusiasm. We need to think here about what the image of that work ethic does and how it vibrates and reverberates throughout the organization or the team. And especially if this person is in a high profile leadership role or is someone that people look up to. And then how do we handle that? How do we motivate that? That is a leadership challenge. Failing to act. This it falls into a couple different categories. The idea here is that they don't um, engage when they need to. They are unable to make a decision. This often is from lack of self-confidence. Remembering that refusing to make a decision is a decision and usually won't end well. So here the idea is thinking about, what point do you actually need to make a decision? And when you've made the decision, but you've recognized that it is not the correct decision, when do you pivot? When do you make those adjustments to get back on track? And then how do you deal with unpopular or controversial decisions that people may not like? Ineffective communication. To me, this goes across almost all of these. The inability or unwillingness to communicate, either written or verbally. They can't explain decisions or reasoning, failing to be articulate, not engaging in dialogue, not being an active listener. Some of this could go to indifference or arrogance, very similar to some of the other acts of commission that we saw earlier. So as leaders, how do we improve our personal communication skills? What is it that people need to hear? Not just what they want to hear, but what they actually need to hear. And how can you do it, right? Not only in words, but in actions, in follow-up, and making sure that your communication is consistent. The tone, the words, the order, everything is really important in this. lack of interpersonal skills. These are 4 Ds: disengaged, detached, distance, or disinterested. Lack of interpersonal skills is really the death knell of many senior leaders and many people at any organizational level. They can't maintain positive relationships. They're very difficult to work with, and the relationships become strained or non-existent. This is a huge problem because then it links into many other things. So the question is, how can you show interest and invest in your people? What if they are having a bad day, right? How can we help them? How do we support them? How do we get them to understand the impacts that they have on their team? Finally, we have lack of integrity. This is really problematic, right? We can't take them at their word. There's no follow through. They fail to live up to the core values. This quote again from the study: poor integrity, or the perception thereof, had a lingering effect on those who identified this. Obviously, policing is a public trust. Anything we do in the government is all about trust from our stakeholders, both internal and external. So what do you do about those whose character you don't trust, who may not rise to the level of true policy or legal violations? One of the issues here could be people who have patterns of small but over time continuous repeated issues. How do we deal with them? It's very, very problematic. So what does all of this mean for you as a leader? Certainly self-reflection is very important here. The question of exhibiting, if you have exhibited some of these traits, are there patterns that you can discern for yourself? What about the way you interact with others? What about working for somebody who exhibits these characteristics? Think about the opposites of those 10 acts and how that then becomes and translates into effective leadership. And are there areas of development to work on these, and how could you do that? These are all really good questions that you can start with. So let's take that. Look at the positive leadership aspects. Think of role models, right? At the beginning, we asked to talk about ineffective leaders. Think about effective leaders, and then take those attributes and identify them and say, okay, what was the opposite of the ineffective traits? And how did that person really exemplify what it meant to be a leader? Are you modeling these positive attributes, right? I love this quote from the study. Strong leaders find ways to avoid personal and professional errors more often than those who surround them. And of course, we want to talk about errors in the sense of real problems, not necessarily mistakes that are learning opportunities, right? We all want to make sure that we can take calculated risks to be able to make mistakes that we can learn from, right, and bounce back from. But of course, the professional and personal errors that we've talked about in the ineffective police leadership traits are really problematic, right? There's very little ability to bounce back from many of these. How do we support our team? How do we develop them? How do we give them the tools that they need to succeed? We also want to look at what the culture of our organization, our agency, or our team is. How is that? How do people come together, right? I think one of the important things that comes from this study is a quote that I'll read. Though perceptions may not equate with actual performance, a leader who is perceived as ineffective might be reasonably presumed to achieve lesser outcomes by virtue of that stigmatizing label. So this is what we want to avoid. We want to be able to look at the positives in this situation. Three things that you may want to take into consideration as you walk through this. First of all, are you being aware, right? Have you done some self-reflection? Have you identified and recognized those inhibitors, either in yourself or in others? Have you asked other people? Are you cognizant of how your actions, your words, your bearing impacts other people? Secondly, pausing. How can I help make this a positive interaction? This is literally happening in the moment. So you're as you're talking, as you're acting, you can literally take a moment in the conversation or in the action to think about turning whatever situation it is from a potential negative into a positive, right? Adding that in is so important. Finally, acting. That entails listening effectively, working on articulating and being transparent and explaining reasoning that helps others and understand. The development piece that we've talked about, and developing yourself too. That's another important, critical aspect. And then finally, how can you practice the effective leadership traits? Basically, the opposites of the acts of commission and omission. Another really important piece here. Those who desire to be a leader bear responsibility for educating themselves on various theories, styles, perspectives. We also need to recognize here that the organization and the leadership has an important role in this as well, right? We have to make sure that we role model effective leadership traits. This is really important. We have to do this for ourselves, for our profession, for the way we work, right? This is so critical to make sure that we have positive leadership and positive outcomes. Because without it, we know the research shows that poor leadership is linked with so many bad outcomes, both internally and externally. We cannot have that in these situations. And we need to really take some time to think about how we can do better and how we can improve. I hope this was helpful and interesting. Here is the link to the Schaefer Journal of Criminal Justice article. Now, it is from 2010, but I think it has so much relevance. And I'm guessing that if we replicated this study again today, 13, 14 years later, that it would probably come back very, very similar. So those are enduring qualities that we need to make sure the ineffective ones are left behind and the positive ones are what we focus on. I hope this has been helpful. Thanks for watching and be well.